Somewhere in a freezer in Shenzhen sits a hard drive containing over 100,000 human genomes, and buried inside that data is a number that made geneticists stop and reread their own results twice. Not because the math was wrong, because it suggested that the story we'd been telling ourselves about human sameness was too simple. For most of the 20th century, the comforting scientific consensus was this: strip away skin color, strip away the shape of an eyelid or the texture of hair, and every human being is essentially running the same genetic software. Race, as a biological concept, was declared all but meaningless, a thin coat of paint over an identical engine. And in the IDUS, most important sense, that idea holds up beautifully. No population on Earth owns a monopoly on intelligence, virtue, or worth. But biology, it turns out, doesn't always respect the tidy conclusions we'd like it to reach. And when large-scale genome sequencing projects in East Asia began comparing hundreds of thousands of DNA samples against European reference databases, they didn't find a copy-paste blueprint. They found fingerprints, different ones, shaped by different journeys. To understand why this mattered, you have to go back roughly 60 to 70,000 years to a series of small bands of Homo sapiens walking out of northeastern Africa. Genetic reconstructions suggest the group that eventually became the ancestors of nearly every non-African person alive to die may have numbered only in the low thousands, a population that small carries, only a fraction of the genetic variety that existed back in Africa, which is why, to this day, a single village in Ethiopia or Tanzania can contain more raw genetic diversity than the entire population of East Asia or Europe combined. That part of the old story was true. What nobody fully expected was how differently that founding diversity would get reshuffled once those small bands split, scattered, and settled into radically different environments. Because that's the piece so often left out of the popular narrative. Evolution didn't stop the moment humans left Africa. It kept going, relentlessly, silently, for tens of thousands of years in every valley, coastline, and mountains. And range our ancestors occupied, the same brutal filter kept operating. Survive long enough to reproduce, or don't. And the pressures applying that filter in the river deltas of southern China were not the same pressures applying it on the frozen plains of Scandinavia. Take a single gene, one that most people have never heard of, ADAR, specifically a variant called V3N70A. This mutation doesn't just tweak one thing, it reaches into the development of hair follicles, sweat glands, and even the shape of teeth. In European populations, this particular variant is genuinely rare, appearing in a small minority of people. In East Asian populations, it is almost universal, present in the overwhelming majority. Researchers have traced its rapid spread to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 years ago in East Asia. Astonishingly recent, geologically speaking. That kind of speed has a name in population genetics, a selective sweep. It happens when NA mutation delivers such a powerful survival advantage that it explodes through a population in a few thousand years, instead of drifting along passively for hundreds of thousands. Something about that gene helped someone, somewhere in ancient East Asia, survive and reproduce more high than their neighbors, possibly through more efficient sweat gland density suited to a humid climate, possibly through some advantage we haven't identified yet. Within a relative evolutionary heartbeat, it became the default setting for an entire branch of humanity. And ITER is far from alone. Climb nearly 4,000 meters above sea level onto the Tibetan Plateau, and you'll find a population that can function normally in oxygen conditions that would leave most lowlanders gasping, dizzy, and at serious risk of life-threatening altitude sickness. For years, scientists assumed this was simply cultural adaptation or lung capacity built up over a lifetime. Then came the genome. Buried in Tibetan DNA is a variant of a gene called EPAS1 that regulates how the body responds to low oxygen. And remarkably, this variant doesn't match anything found in modern humans elsewhere. It matches Denisovan DNA, a mysterious cousin species of archaic humans known mostly from a handful of bone fragments in a Siberian cave. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of Tibetans, interbred with Denisovans, inherited this oxygen-regulating gift. And it proved so valuable in high-altitude survival that natural selection locked it in. It is, quite literally, a genetic gift from an extinct branch of humanity, still functioning inside living people today. Moved down from the plateau into the rice-farming heartlands of the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys, and a different kind of adaptation appears, this one written in starch. The AMY1 gene controls the production of an enzyme called salivary amylase, the very thing that begins breaking down carbohydrates the moment food hit. That's your tongue. Populations with agricultural histories built around starch-heavy staples, particularly rice, tend to carry a higher number of copies of this gene, allowing more efficient digestion of exactly the food their ancestors depended on most. Meanwhile, in dairy-herding populations across parts of Europe, an entirely different adaptation took hold. Lactase persistence, the ability to keep digesting milk sugar well into adulthood, something most mammals, including most humans on Earth, actually lose after infancy. Two completely different evolutionary bets, placed by two completely different agricultural revolutions, thousands of miles and thousands of years apart, both etched permanently into the genome. These aren't cosmetic footnotes, they cascade. A gene that changes how efficiently your body processes starch also changes your insulin response. That changes how your body stores fat. That changes your long-term cardiovascular risk profile. Multiply this kind of chain reaction across dozens of genes governing metabolism, and you start to understand why a growing body of pharmacogenomic research, the study of how genes affect drug response, has quietly upended a core assumption of modern medicine. For decades, the vast majority of clinical drug trials were conducted primarily on European ancestry populations, and the resulting dosing guidelines were treated as a universal default. But certain blood pressure medications, commonly prescribed, anticoagulants, and specific chemotherapy compounds have shown measurably different efficacy and side effect profiles in East Asian patients. Differences traced directly back to variations in genes that control how the liver metabolizes these drugs. This isn't speculation dressed up as science. It's precisely why an increasing number of pharmaceutical companies now run separate clinical trial arms for East Asian populations, and why some countries have entirely different standard dosing charts for the exact same medication. So the deeper researchers dug, the clearer one thing became. Human populations are not interchangeable biological units wearing different costumes, different environments, different altitudes, different diets, different pathogens, different climates, placed different evolutionary pressures on different founding populations. And after tens of thousands of years of separation, those pressures left measurable reproducible signatures in the genome. This is not a fringe claim. It is now considered established mainstream population genetics. But here is where the story demands enormous care, because this is exactly the point where legitimate science has historically been hijacked by people looking G for a shortcut to ugly conclusions. When early findings about population-level genetic variation began circulating, they were quickly followed by an uncomfortable question, whispered more than published. If metabolism can differ this significantly between populations, could cognition differ too? Could there be genetic variants tied to brain development or neurotransmitter function that also diverge along population lines? It's worth explaining why that question is so seductive and why it is also, at present, almost entirely unanswerable in any meaningful way. Not because the answer is being suppressed, but because the science genuinely isn't there yet, and likely won't be, for a long time. Traits like intelligence, memory, or temperament aren't governed by one gene or even a dozen. They emerge from the combined, tangled influence of many thousands of genetic variants, each contributing an almost imperceptibly small effect, interacting constantly with nutrition, education, culture, trauma, opportunity, and pure chance, pointing to a handful of genes that happen to differ in frequency between two populations, and drawing a straight line to cognitive ability isn't cutting-edge science. It's the same seductive shortcut that fueled some of the darkest chapters in scientific history, from phrenology to forced sterilization programs justified by supposedly objective genetic hierarchies. Those movements always insisted the data spoke for itself. It never did. The interpretation was doing all the work, and the interpretation was poison. There's also a statistical reality that gets lost every single time this debate reignites, and it deserves to be said plainly. The genetic variation between any two individuals within the same population is, on average, dramatically larger than the average genetic difference between populations as a whole. Pick any two people at random from the same city, the same ethnic background, even the same extended family, and their genomes will differ from each other far more than the average genetic distance separating entire continental populations. Population-level patterns are real, and they matter enormously for medicine, but they describe subtle shifts in probability distributions, not fixed categories, and they say precisely nothing about what any individual person is capable of. Which brings us to the genuinely strange part of this story, the part that reads less like settled science and more like an open case file. Buried in sequencing data from East Asian genomes, researchers have occasionally flagged small segments of DNA that don't cleanly match known human lineages, not modern Homo sapiens, not the Neanderthal contribution found across European and West Asian genomes, not even the Denisovan contribution found in some Asian and oceanic populations. These fragments are rare, subtle, and still deeply debated. Some scientists suspect they're evidence of interbreeding with a still undiscovered archaic human population. Somewhere in ancient Asia, a ghost lineage known only through the faint genetic echo it left behind, with no fossil ever recovered to put a face to it. Others argue it could simply be statistical noise, or convergent mutations that arose independently to solve similar environmental problems. Nobody currently has a confident answer, somewhere out there. A may be an entire branch of the human family tree that we've never held a single bone from, known only because a few molecules of its DNA are quietly still being copied inside people alive today. What all of this ultimately reveals isn't a hierarchy. It's a portrait of astonishing adaptability. The same species, splitting apart tens of thousands of years ago, then independently solving an extraordinary range of survival problems using nothing but time, pressure, and the raw material of mutation. High-altitude oxygen scarcity, starch-heavy agricultural diets, pathogen exposure, climate extremes. Each environment asked a different question, and each population that endured it answered in its own genetic dialect. That's not a story about which humans are better. It's a story about how relentlessly inventive evolution is when a species scatters across an entire planet. The genome, in the end, isn't a report card. It's a travel journal, written in a language of adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, recording where our ancestors went, what nearly killed them, and what small mutations quietly saved them instead. Every population on Earth is carrying a slightly different version of that journal, shaped by a slightly different journey. The real story being written by scientists right now isn't about proving one people superior to another. It's about finally reading the fine print of a shared human story that started in one place and unfolded across every corner of the globe, and realizing that the differences etched into our DNA, when understood correctly, aren't a wall between us. They're a record of just how far and how creatively our species has learned to survive.